Hello and welcome to today's PASS session hosted by Dell Technologies. Today's topic is essentially the hybrid cloud discussion. And it's not a new story, but the advent of hybrid resources for data services has enabled a fundamental change in how data is being addressed. In today's session, we'll cover how Microsoft SQL Server 2019 changed the rules of data gravity by taking data virtualization to a completely whole new level. And along with containerization, this evolution has enabled organizations to take a more holistic approach to infrastructure data management and other things as they continue with their SQL Server journey. And now enters Azure Arc, which brings Azure data services to on-premises, multi-cloud, and specifically edge environments. It is an enabler for edge computing. And this makes it possible for organizations to draw insights from data where it is being created. And the data created here, in many cases, is the most valuable data to many businesses. I appreciate you joining this review of how SQL Server 2019 can help you accelerate your IT transformation, as well as discuss what's next with the addition of Azure Arc. My name is Steve McMaster. I've been working with Dell Technologies for a little over 2 decades. My role is within our Technical Alliances group in support of Microsoft Complex Solutions, data services in particular. I'm a technology strategist within that group, and I pull from experience in technical sales and marketing, as well as product group experience around the ready solution offerings that we have at Dell for Microsoft SQL, as well as thought leadership of not just our focus today, but where the general data journey is taking us today and tomorrow. So let's take a moment and remind ourselves of what Microsoft SQL strategy is today. In short, it's an awareness that data should be addressed to enable intelligence over all data. All underscored, underlined is the call out here. Microsoft has performed key changes in how SQL is architected and how it can touch data resources. With SQL 2019, we can enable consumption of pretty much every data source out there with data virtualization and specifically Polybase. This, in concert with the Apache Spark engine running concurrently with the SQL engine, allows access to all the data out there. Traditional relational data, structured data, and importantly, things that we couldn't touch in the past, unstructured data and streaming data. In integrating all the data together, we combine data from many sources without moving or replicating it. We eliminate ETL or ELT. We can access current data. We can maintain security, and we can scale out data mart cache data to boost performance. And then we can manage all the data. SQL Server can now read and write to HDFS. So you can store high volume data in a data lake and analyze it easily, either using T-SQL or Spark managed services, as well as admin portals and integrated security that just makes it all easy to manage. And then finally is analyzing that data, right? Getting insight off of that data to perform analytics over structured and unstructured data in real time. You can easily feed integrated data from many different sources to your model so that you can do training. You can ingest and prep data, train, store, operationalize all those model ideas in one system. Now, you may recognize that these abilities in SQL 2019, and especially the big data cluster, sounds a whole lot like Azure Data Services and the Azure Public Cloud, and you would be right. There are amazing commonalities within these two targets, and that leads particularly to the value of hybrid cloud. I can perform data services wherever it makes the most sense to my business. We find over and over and over again that it's not an all or nothing reality for most of our customers. Think of hybrid cloud as being a dial where I can pivot my needs between both solutions based off my business needs. Those could be costs, security. Commonly, we see that with industry regulation, latency, speed of light, data gravity, whatever metric I choose to address. It is also important to note, although this audience today is already intimately familiar with this reality, that SQL is the most widely used database, 4 times more installed than Oracle, In fact, in many of these Oracle implementations, they have SQL running somewhere under the covers. It's a huge multi-billion-dollar market across businesses of all sizes. And when we think about the headlines of data deployments, most of the news is about public cloud growth, and that is true. But of super interest is realizing that it's not just coming at the expense of on-prem implementations. Right now, about 3/4 of all data currently resides on premises, and our customers continually engage us to understand and adopt hybrid cloud implementations from edge to core to cloud. Now, we've continually recognized that there isn't just one answer on how to address your data. It is fundamentally a journey. In most cases, it's not a buy this and all your problems go away event. And as we look on the very near-term horizon, we see so many paths to take that there isn't just one path for all. So following the SQL modernization journey from left to right, from legacy SQL 2008 to each next version of SQL Server, we notice an interesting progression. There are SQL engine options that are emerging. So as we look at the legacy SQL Server, that's 2008 and older, and yes, that's still out there. As a matter of fact, some of the metrics are up to half of all the installs out there are 2008 or older. Some are virtual, but many of those are older physical server constructs using some of the older failover cluster technology. Now, there's still value in the idea of running bare metal and having the least amount of overhead, but perhaps at the cost of addressing SQL with some limitations, especially when we start looking at it from an as a service and a cloud point of view. So that leads us to what many people have from a current SQL point of view. It's SQL 2012 and greater, where we see SQL virtualization has effectively become the norm of SQL Server. You get application level HA and DR, and that emerges with the always-on groups. And then in SQL 2016, the inclusion of the goodness that was available in APS, the analytics platform system, they took that and incorporated most of those resources into SQL 2016. And then they took that great idea and all the resources that were there, and then they abstracted SQL from just being tied to Windows Server in 2017 and enabled the reality of SQL on Linux. That in turn leads to the stage of today and the immediate future, the future SQL Server, which you can make an argument that this is becoming SQL now. It's SQL 2019, and you see the containerization of SQL Server orchestrated by Kubernetes. Now, this isn't just for 2019. We could do some of that in the earlier setups with SQL, but the containerization of SQL Server orchestrated by Kubernetes is the big play within 2019. K8's running on a hypervisor or a physical server, which leads to the ability of running big data cluster. I can shard separate containers for compute and storage, all of these managed by SQL 2019. And this is where we at Dell saw the data journey going. Over the last couple of years, Dell has invested in container interfaces, practically our entire product line, to enable persistencies in these ephemeral constructs with containerization. The knowledge that the data itself is persistent from the application's point of view. And this is true for any architecture here, server, traditional storage, SAN, CI, HCI, and all the aspects of hybrid cloud that we'll be talking about today. And by the way, that's not just VMware constructs. You might associate Dell VMware. It's not just VMware constructs, but also the entire Azure Stack family, as well as open architectures like OpenShift. And this in turn gets us down the line of thinking of all these resources being from an as a service point of view and the goodness that cloud ideas bring to the table. And while this is definitely true for the path that Microsoft is taking, Microsoft aren't the only ones looking this route. We see containerized solutions with Oracle and Kafka, solutions integrators in which they're using custom apps. I make a joke, but it's not so much a joke, that it's a containerized world we're living in, and we're just not recognizing it. Every data resource is seeing the value of the nimbleness that containerization brings to the table. So we recognize within Dell the need for a holistic model of how to approach data services in a hybrid world. Now, there is a fantastic blog that my friend Robert Saunders wrote about this idea. I highly encourage you to take a few minutes to read his thoughts. It's called Dell Technologies and Focus Blog, Why Canonicalization Should Be a Core Component of Your SQL Server Modernization, Part 2. Part 1 is great. Part 2 is fantastic. Again, a fantastic blog with Rob Saunders. And I encourage you to go out and read that. And when we think about the detail here of this holistic model, to enable the future state and all the goodness coming from containerization technologies, guidance from our friends at Microsoft continues to focus on getting this underlying foundation right. If the storage isn't solid, Kubernetes can just fall apart. So in summary, Dell Technologies infrastructure, we feel like we're best positioned to drive consistency up and down the stack to make optimal decisions concerning all the layers identified in this image. Now, not all of the layers will be applicable for every build. Your mileage will vary. Some of these converge into perhaps 3 or 4 different layers of construct, although all of these can be used and called out and should at least be addressed. So let's look at the architecture here. Starting at the bottom layer, we can address the infrastructure, right? So we'll start maybe on the server side. Memory in general, the advent of storage class memory, so PMEM, and a whole bunch of all-flash storage. And storage considerations of the storage units themselves are included in these use cases that they'll help drive decisions to be made later within the layers as we go up the stack. And there's a whole hodgepodge of questions here. Encryption, compression, are they in the mix? Are you looking to repurpose data? HA, DR conversations, these are all spawned here. Structured data, unstructured data, block, file, object, yes to all. We have to address backup and recovery, networking. How are we going to wire up? How are all these as a service resources going to communicate? All of these questions are addressed within our Dell Technologies portfolio of infrastructure products. Then moving up the stack, virtualization comes into the mix here as well. And there's a bunch of different ways to address that layer. ESXi, Hyper-V, KVM, RHEV. This discussion might be pulled into the next layer up as well, into the software-defined data center constructs. And there's a bunch of different resources that can be leveraged here. The Azure Stack family of Hub and HCI and Edge. VMware has a family of vSAN up through VxRail. And then, of course, the open platforms provided by Red Hat OpenStack, or there's a broad view of software-defined anything that we haven't even addressed much yet, talking about PowerFlex. Again, this layer may be optional for some, but using this technology, we need to think about how we're going to enable the containerization layer as selections right here affect the decisions to be made upstream. So then, of course, that leads us to the operating system. Now, it's super cool that we have more options here now. No longer is it just a SQL tied to Windows Server answer. While that's a fantastic answer, we see SQL with Linux rocketing up in conversations and use cases, and that really helps enable this containerization story. Now, we could stop right here. We could place SQL right on the OS and be done, but then we'd be missing some of the really cool enablement features that the rest of the stack brings to the table. So containerization comes into the mix now. And this is where the Dell investments in containerization, I feel, really pays off. The persistency discussion is important, as the container interfaces are almost like a shim of enablement for everything above. It provides the resilience you need all the way up to the top of the stack. And the decisions we made earlier below affect the decisions here. Do I stick on the VMware path? Do I use vSphere or VCF and all the way upstream to Tanzu? Or is it a different flavor? Do I leverage Red Hat OpenShift and its smart management features? Do I stick in an all Microsoft construct? Do I use Microsoft build leveraging AKS, the Azure Kubernetes service, and Arc management above that? Now, all of these are very applicable based off your experience, your desired outcomes, and what you're comfortable with using. So we then have a platform that can use all the features of SQL 2019 up through Big Data Cluster and the goodness that Arc Data Services brings to the table. And it's also critically important you recognize you don't have to do this all at once. But as you plan your journey forward and you think about how the build you're making now can be enabled for the goodness that containerization brings into the mix, it might not be needed today or 6 months from now or a year from now, but at some point in the very near future, you will likely wish to turn this capability on. So let's talk about turning these capabilities on. The foundation is the operating system and the enablement it provides. So with SQL 2017, we had the additional option of leveraging Linux. And then with 2019, we find in some scenarios that SQL and Linux can actually outperform SQL and Windows. And again, your mileage will vary depending on use case factors. But just the ability to use SQL on Linux really sets the stage for what we're going to be talking about up the stack. And we at Dell, we've deeply invested for the last few years in enabling these technologies on a broad suite of platforms. There's a number of white papers and reference guides that are published that you can help you jumpstart with these new options, read through the white paper, kind of get you further down the road here. We listed a few of them here for your reference. Now, it's important that we start with this SQL Server on Linux because it sets the stage next up the path, SQL on containers. Now, this is no longer considered rocket science. Like I recall right when I was first started getting into the technology a number of years ago, it was kind of a kooky, odd words and things that were just way different ways of thinking. It's not looking way over the horizon any longer. Now, containerization is becoming mainstream and enables all the cool what's next features that we'll cover for the remainder of this conversation. Containerization provides a flexible platform for even the most complex applications and databases. Containerization of SQL Server databases empowers companies to deploy updates and upgrades on the fly and with portability. So I can build locally, deploy it in the cloud, and run anywhere, or vice versa. However, we got to be conscious that containers are designed to be short-lived, in some instances stateless. It's for this very reason that when building or updating SQL Server databases in a containerized environment, organizations need to ensure that their data is persistent and will survive through the restart or rescheduling or the deletion of a container. So to effectively address the challenges of stateless containers and the need for persistent storage, we at Dell Technology, our solutions have provided unique CSI, container storage interface plugins, which allow customers to deliver that persistency for container-based applications in both development and production at scale. The combination of the Kubernetes orchestration system and what Dell Technology Storage CSI plugins brings, they combine to enable a simplified provisioning of containers and persistent storage. Again, we have a number of white papers and reference documentation available for you on a number of Dell-enabled platforms. And again, this step allows us to proceed to full functionality of what SQL Server 2019 can bring to you. SQL Server 2019 brings big data clusters. And we recognize data is everywhere, coming from multiple sources and in different formats, well beyond structured SQL contracts that we've known and loved for years. Harvesting more data from more sources to provide actionable insights quickly, cost effectively, that's the key. That's the key for accelerating business innovation. And it is clear that running traditional data warehouses and databases on isolated infrastructures has really become untenable. From an IT model, with the area of petabyte data stores and real-time analytics, it feels a bit old school. So Dell Technologies, we provide these foundational solutions. When you're looking at ingestion and prep of SQL relational data into data lakes, insight with artificial intelligence, machine learning models, this type of solution lets you take advantage of these next generation analytics and go behind your data to actually draw valuable insights. Now, all of these super cool capabilities are getting insight over all, again, underlined all the data, requires that we recognize that this is all built in a Kubernetes construct. You see that big rectangle around the whole thing, and in the upper right, you see the nice little symbol of the steering wheel there for Kubernetes from a nautical theme. Many of the capabilities you see in Azure Public Cloud Data Services are available here within Big Data Cluster. And picking and choosing what to be used and where in concert with Azure Public Cloud Services, those are the levers that you can pull to activate. And again, this is no longer just an idea, but solid reality. We at Dell jumped into this model at the end of last year and have published a number of white papers and references covering a huge range of Dell platforms. We see this as the next big thing from a Microsoft Data Services point of view. And that leads us to the following idea. So, Steve, everything you've covered so far has been very on-prem in focus. I want to do more as a service features, but seeing this is built off of a version of SQL 2019 specifically, what if I wish to instead consume something more evergreen and cloud native? Well, all right, let's talk just about that. Now, as you likely know, Microsoft announced the culmination of many irons in a fire around using cloud capabilities to manage end nodes, Kubernetes constructs, and data services. November of last year at Microsoft's Ignite conference, we learned of this path forward with the naming of Azure Arc. Azure Arc is a set of technologies. It's not just one thing. It's actually 3 things, 5 things, depends on the point of view. But it's a set of technologies that extends Azure Public Cloud Management resources and enables Azure services to run across on-premises, multi-cloud, and edge, not just exclusively in the Azure Public Cloud any longer. So let's dive into more specifically. Now, Arc is 3 things, and like I mentioned, maybe 5 things, but we'll get to that shortly. But the first 2 are pretty neat. Arc for servers allows me to manage servers, both physical and virtual, anywhere, any location, any data center, any edge device, whatever cloud you wish to be using. You can use the same Azure management plane that you've been using for some time in the Azure cloud to provide a single governance model across all these divides. In this construct, I can place a SQL Server on a VM in my data center, install the Arc agent and SQL agent, and can get insight on what is occurring at that location. Now, this was announced as generally available at the most recent Microsoft Ignite conference just a few short weeks ago. And then we think of Arc for Kubernetes, and that continues this idea. Using orchestrations that Kubernetes enables, that I can deploy pods of ephemeral containerized resources on-prem or multi-cloud at scale. And this allows me to leverage cloud as a service with cloud models, DevOps models, and consistently across multiple environments. Now, this just recently moved from private to public preview. So it's available for you right now to get started on this process and kick the tires. Now, but what is super cool and most exciting to me, being a data services guy, is the last summation with Arc Data Services. The idea of deploying Azure Data Services in an evergreen manner. So let's cover that in some more depth. The first call out is actually at the bottom. Remember the statement that it's a containerized world that we were living in? I talked about that earlier. Well, that's in full effect here. Just like SQL 2019 Big Data Cluster, which required a Kubernetes environment, Arc Data Services only runs in a Kubernetes environment. All that holistic stack model we talked about earlier is in play right here. Only instead of managing a SQL instance from a virtualization up point of view, I instead do this from an Azure Cloud down point of view. I'm using Azure SQL, Azure PostgreSQL, on-prem or multi-cloud, but it's the same Azure Evergreen, meaning always current SQL version that's been available with Azure Public Cloud for some time. And being based off of a Kubernetes architecture, it becomes the definition of nimble. I get deployment in seconds. Automation is scalular. I think I may be making up a word there, but I get automation at scale. There's one unified point of view here being cloud down. I get consumption-based pricing and, importantly, all the security features that you come to expect with Microsoft and SQL. Again, this feature just moved from private to public preview. So I encourage you to kick the tires on these features as well now. Now, I'm going to pause for a moment and talk about resources for containers, as this is important. Microsoft hosts these solutions in the Microsoft Container Registry that interfaces with Docker Hub and GitHub and a few other models to provide that evergreen version of the container service from Microsoft importing that detail within. Customers are then able to pull that container, like let's pick Arc Azure SQL. I'm able to pull that container directly into the infrastructure or on a hosted private repository. And I can query for the latest update of that container and use the management features of Kubernetes to perform my update in a rolling model and ensure that my SQL pods are always up to date and ready to run. Now, this is far less complex and much simpler than many of the existing processes out there, and allows the database administrator to perform deployments and updates truly at internet speeds. So now that we talked about that, let's deep dive into these Azure data services provided by Azure Arc. And we'll start at the bottom, if you remember our holistic model. That Dell infrastructure is available in a number of different platforms, software-defined, virtualized. You get the persistency based off your specific needs. All those things are included. That in turn enables a number of Kubernetes nodes that become I like to use the term fertile field of enablement for all these great containerized applications to land on. It's like planting seeds. They just grow. It's a fertile field. So if I use Azure Data Studio, which many of you are intimately familiar, I use the AZ data and the kubectl commands to enable the K8 APIs. And that gets those nodes ready to actually start working for us. Now, as we covered, now I pull down the goodness from the Microsoft Container Registry, and I start to engage the Azure Arc Data Controller. And from this interface, I have access to controls I need to deploy the applications where needed and at what scale I desire. I have the options to set up monitoring, HA, DR, provisioning, patching, as well as backup. So now I connect to the Azure cloud. I confirm inventory, logs, telemetry, retention, and building consumption, and then back down, I receive identities, role-based access control, security, and deployment details. And then boom, I deploy my apps based off of need. I have the options of PostgreSQL at hyperscale, instances of Azure SQL and with HA, should I wish. And there are some super cool things coming next that you see labeled as, air quotes, future. At the last Ignite conference, the Arc breakout talked about both Cosmos DB as well as some of the features of the Synapse group of products, analytics, BI, and such. Now, this will probably not be in this calendar year, but again, it shows how important Arc data services off of a Kubernetes construct will be going forward. Remember, this can be deployed anywhere that supports Kubernetes. Obviously in the cloud, but very importantly, on-prem at the core and at the intelligent edge. So what does this look like in the real world? Well, here's a scenario. Here's a customer scenario where we have an energy company, has a number of different production sites that have resulted in massive data volume at the edge, and a real need for insight where the data is created, insight off of that data, where it's being generated. Now, they've heard of these hybrid cloud innovations, and while being concerned about security, they're really looking to get this as a service benefit and all the things we covered earlier. But today they have some legacy issues. In their core data center, they have some very manual processes with a variety of versions of databases, a whole bunch of VMs, and maybe a little bit of containers. But at the edge is really where the issue is. The coding for sync and AI, they need that, but their current architecture just not support these features. They want to do all the really exciting Azure data services we talked about, but they just can't connect with the remoteness of these locations. So you run into problems with data and latency, speed of light. That's where Arc Data Services comes into play. Bring the cloud to the data. Bring the as a service to the data. I get all the cool features of the Azure resources. I get policy, security, RBAC with the Kubernetes construct at the core and also at the edge. And by doing this, I can run on existing current Dell architectures that support a Kubernetes environment. And therefore, I have peace of mind knowing that I'm running the most current version of SQL and PostgreSQL, and I can leverage the SQL built-in AI at the edge in real time, where the data is being created and insight is most urgently needed. This is hybrid, true hybrid, made real. So coming up for air, if we look at Azure Arc in totality, it brings a number of different things to the hybrid need. I get server management with your choice of operating systems, Windows and Linux. Kubernetes controls all with the enablement that the K8 tools brings to the table. And most importantly for me, I think this is super cool, of great interest, the initial wave of data services. So Arc Azure SQL and PostgreSQL resourced with Azure Data Studio and managed by the Azure Resource Manager. So regardless of how you're using these hybrid tools, traditional SQL on servers and virtual machines and containers via Arc, rest assured with the knowledge that Dell has the infrastructure to support any of these needs. Server, storage, SAN, HCI, CI. I got to also talk about PowerScale. That gives me that broad unstructured architectures. All of these can be leveraged as a target of your data modernization journey. So all these Azure Arc data services are now available for you, whether they're generally available or in preview. There's no limits like there has been in the past when they were in private preview. So download the services, kick the tires, let them know what you think. Because of how broad our Dell solutions are, I can make a very declarative statement. Only Dell Technologies can provide the end-to-end and certified edge to core to cloud strategy to meet the data needs of the intelligent enterprise. From client to edge to core to cloud to services, support, Dell has you covered. And speaking of services, I would be remiss not to provide a quick commercial of Dell's amazing services group. For many people, this containerization journey is brand new. You're looking for help and guidance. SQL on Linux, SQL in containers, SQL in big data clusters, Arc data services. A lot of this stuff is brand spanking new for a lot of the audience here. We've been partners with Microsoft for over 35 years. We're the most important and influential partner to Microsoft's enterprise business. We've won more Partner of the Year awards than anyone. And we recognize when Microsoft grants competencies to a partner, it demonstrates a proficiency in a particular area by having both skilled employees as well as satisfied customers. And we have pretty much all the competencies that you can earn. There are over 16,000 certified employees at Dell across customer support, maintenance, deployment, training, and very importantly, consulting. So when you're looking for guidance, how to implement this, how I go from my as is to be in my data modernization journey, reach out to Dell. Dell Consulting Services can definitely help you here. Now, if you'd like to learn more, including all the fantastic reference materials I covered earlier, head over to delltechnologies.com and within the pages with the / both for SQL and Microsoft. And then the actual publications and the white papers and the reference details are located in our Info Hub. Again, that's infohub.delltechnologies.com. So thank you for your time and attention. We'll pivot over to any unanswered questions in the QA in the chat section. Again, we're very happy to continue our partnership with the PaaS community and with you specifically. Again, a reminder, your feedback is super important for us. So please visit the session evaluation link on the left-hand side navigation bar to actually rate this session. And be sure to submit before November 20th if you wish to be eligible for cool prizes. And finally, there is a ton of additional information for you during this PAS conference, and those other PAS engagement opportunities are available for you. So continue to engage with the PAS website. Thank you again. Feel free to contact me directly as you need. Have a great day.